The night had arrived, the solar wind bent like a harp string, and the heliosphere rang with a note only instruments could hear, a razor-thin overtone of motion that wrote its own geometry in the dark. It came not as a heralded comet with a smoky crown, but as a disciplined cipher of rock and ice, all angles and silence, sliding down the sun's gravity well, with the confidence of a voyager that had crossed gulfs broader than our myths. In the first hours, the sky surveys woke, robotic telescopes swiveling, CCDs cooling, pipelines chewing photons into numbers, and in those numbers the signature was relentless, a hyperbolic path, V above escape, eccentricity comfortably greater than 1, and a light curve that flashed a heartbeat of rotation too exact to be an accident and too imperfect to be a machine's boast. Atop the raw data, the cadence of humanity assembled, graduate students with coffee-ringed notebooks, mission planners pulling up old intercept studies, theorists fishing equations for exotic drifts, and the quiet hum of servers exhaling the truth we did not yet know how to tell ourselves. We gave it a name the way sailors christen currents, a dry tag, 3i Atlas, thin as carbon paper over the ocean under it. Even then, the discovery felt less like capture and more like acknowledgement. The sky had simply reminded us that we live in a rivershed, and this was a leaf from a forest whose sun does not rise here. Before the designation, there was the human act of noticing, which has always been our first technology, a trailing tale of nightly arcs through near-Earth sky fields, slight but clean, flagged by routines trained to distrust coincidence. Then the preliminary orbit fit, and with it the familiar vertigo of seeing a thing that was never ours to keep. The object's albedo, uncertain but leaning dark, combined with a rotational period that flickered between irregular and rehearsed, a baton oscillating through harmonic possibilities like a metronome conducting a storm. Spectral returns were stingy, the continuum muted, the slopes reddened in a way we've learned to call space weathered, and punctuated by absorption whispers from volatiles that do not stay long when the sun breathes on them. It was uncooperative in precisely the ways that make science beautiful. We plotted its path on ecliptic maps until the ephemerides looked like silk thrown over a globe, threading past the inner planets with a dancer's grace and a chess player's intent. Astronomers love such geometry because the sky is a tyrant for honesty. A hyperbola closing on perihelion is a statement you can test with a yardstick and a stopwatch, and 3i Atlas made and kept its appointments. The press called it a third messenger, a phrase that sounded biblical and was perhaps accurate. If the first taught humility and the second taught patience, this one arrived to test our attention. Through the optical silence, we organized our sensors like a choir taking parts. Broadband photometry for the pulse of its spin, narrowband filters for the breadth of its chemistry, radar proposals drafted in ink too hopeful to dry in time, and the quiet heroism of sub-millimeter dishes listening for the whisper of sublimating molecules. Each instrument sang the same refrain in a different key. The light curve's amplitude hinted at an elongated body, tumbling but with a preference, as if a broken top still remembered the hand that spun it. Thermal models were cruel teachers, constraining size and composition into a box with 3 sides we could see and 1 we could only touch by inference. Radius appearing small, maybe a few hundred meters at most. Surface temperature an argument between sunlight and emptiness. Thermal inertia low enough to suggest regolith or foam. Each parameter braided into the next until the rope held the weight of a story, an interstellar shard, altered by journeys unimaginably long, now taking energy like a cold violin takes sound. Spectroscopically, the object refused the clean labels we gift to comets and asteroids. It was both and neither, a spectrum written in dialect. Even so, the data's humility paired with its precision did a rare thing. It widened our world without needing to dramatize it, like discovering a new room in a house by noticing a draft beneath a doorframe. Then came the mischief in the math, a residue that would not settle, a stubborn, slight acceleration that persisted after you paid the usual debts to gravity. You can call these non-gravitational terms the confessions of a body under forces we pretend to understand. We know outgassing can push a visitor like a sailor's breath on a toy boat. And we know sunlight itself can nudge a surface if it is cunning enough to be thin. But the fit here had a cleanliness that pried at the door of doubt. Correct for solar radiation pressure, account for plausible jets and their seasonal variations, then let the model relax. Still, a sliver remains, like a final puzzle piece that refuses to sit even when the picture is obvious. The direction of the drift was not nonsensical, just tidy. Too tidy for some. Engineers joked, nervously, not seriously, about attitude control, about vanes feathering against the photon wind, about a shape designed to sip momentum the way a gull takes a lift from a cliff's updraft. The serious among them nodded and went back to thermal coefficients and sublimation curves because extraordinary claims are lazy currency if you can buy an explanation with physics already in your wallet. Yet the anomaly sat there like a wink, not enough to convict the universe of mystery, but more than enough to hold the room. In the vacuum where certainty hesitates, imagination goes to work, constructive, disciplined, curious. The conservative story wore sensible shoes. 3i Atlas, as a brittle relic from the first freeze of an alien system, a cometary nucleus whose crust had been baked, irradiated, and then armored by time until its venting was asymmetric and weird. Another hypothesis wore boots, a contact binary or fractal shard making love to its own tumble, presenting cross-sections to the solar wind that changed just so. Then there were the sleek fictions we allowed for a night or two, thin sheets engineered by someone else's century, sails of unthinkably resilient polymer, or mimicked metamaterial harvesting starfire into thrust. A field of view's width farther out stood wilder proposals, a natural von Neumann debris in slow failing, a probe that had fallen asleep and now only dreamed in micro-accelerations. We can afford such speculation because the price of thinking big is lower than it has ever been. Our instruments are good enough to slap our wrists when we stray, and that is a freedom. Picture for a moment the not impossible, a civilization with the patience to seed the galaxy with passive observatories as thin as dawn and as numerous as dust. What would their presence look like in our telescopes? The answer is not obvious, and the correct answer may be indistinguishable from a peculiar rock. Between humility and hubris, there is a bridge called rigor, and we crossed it again and again, carrying theories like offerings and happily burning them for warmth. While ideas flared, the timing set alarms burning low in certain rooms. There is something unnerving about coincidences that stack. A solar wind kink at the exact interval when the drift turned most readable. An alignment in the Earth-Mars line of sight that felt designed for triangulation exercises, and a narrow window where the magnetotail's ripples rendered certain bands unusually transparent. You can explain each alignment with the generosity physics deserves. Probability is not destiny, but it is also not persuasion. Still, our species is tuned to narratives, and when the sky's calendar looks choreographed, we begin to ask whether the music upstairs has a conductor. One needn't leap to intention to find interest. Our heliosphere is not a placid sphere. It is a ragged, breathing boundary, and visitors navigating its layers are like swimmers reading the chop. If 3i Atlas threaded those layers with uncommon grace, that may be nothing more than the truth that only graceful voyages survive to be witnessed. Sometimes the improbable is only what remains after selection has eaten the rest. The mechanics of its passage were their own sermon. Gravitational potentials arranged themselves like an old map, hills and valleys you can traverse with minimal expenditure if you know where to place your feet. The sun provided the grand well, the inner planets, minor dimples, and somewhere in that landscape 3i Atlas found a corridor, the way a cyclist finds a draft between trucks. We mapped its trajectory and patched conics as our ancestors would have mapped trade winds, calculating where a slingshot would shave days or save fuel were we chasing. There was poetry in the numbers, approach vectors, perihelion distances, inclination shifting like a dancer changing partners, then the outbound leg locking into a line that spared the giant planets and spilled cleanly back into the night. If you are generous to coincidence, you say the object fell as it must. If you are exacting, you notice how few small corrections would be needed to turn this from fortuity into plan. In classrooms, instructors drew it on boards, then stepped aside so students could take pictures, not because the math was hard, but because the sight of it, those curves nested in gravity's loom, was beautiful. The geometry of escape is the same across centuries. Ask a question of a well, then climb out on the slope with the smallest cost. Every odyssey has silences, but the quiet that followed perihelion tasted like omission rather than exhaustion. Public feeds coughed, then resumed, a hiccup blamed on maintenance. The cadence of image releases changed tempo, with several sequences truncated at their best bars. Proposals approved in principle were returned with asterisks and apologies, citing scheduling conflicts with instruments that, on paper, were free. The archive, our cathedral of reproducibility, sprouted restricted corridors whose doors wore placards we taught ourselves not to read aloud. It is easy to attribute this to bureaucracy's autopilot. Data embargoes to protect papers, instrument safeties to protect hardware, and the genuine crush of competing priorities. Yet for those awake at 0317 UTC, watching a spectrum appear line by line on a terminal, only to find the final third masked for quality concerns, suspicion is not paranoia. It is the sensory interpretation of a pattern. NASA is not a monolith, but a craft of many compartments, each with air it must keep, reputations it must guard, and laws it must obey. Even so, the mood in the community shifted. Slack channels bruised with redacted attachments, email threads that ended with phone calls, and an uncharacteristic restraint in the usual blogs that treat the public as clever cousins. Let us be charitable and say the institution blinked. Let us be honest and say that in the blink we glimpsed our own reflection, a species that wants to know everything and also wants to be very sure before it speaks. If one steps back from the heat and looks forward with cold intention, the implications run like fault lines beneath our technologies. Suppose the anomaly is only messy physics, sublimation we do not model well, radiatio, and pressure on a shape that makes mirrors of its fractures. Then the lesson is an engineering one. We need better thermal maps, better material models for extrasolar weathering, and a fleet of modest interceptors that can meet such visitors not with distant eyes but with local hands. Suppose in a different ledger that the clean remainder in the acceleration is not an error bar's ghost, but a signature, whether of exotic natural processes or, more audaciously, of design. Then the lesson multiplies. To build instruments that can tell the difference, to write selection criteria that do not throw away the strange, and to allocate mission risk to chase what spreadsheets cannot guarantee. In both futures, the same tools emerge: fast response launchers, autonomous guidance systems that can adapt to an object's caprice, spectrometers with dynamic ranges that can hold their breath through a surprise, and most importantly, a culture that treats openness not as a slogan, but as a survival strategy. The next object will not wait for us to be ready. It will come on an ordinary Tuesday, while someone is fixing a printer and someone else is going home early to see a child's school play. Preparation is not a speech, it is a budget line and a habit. And beyond tools, there is the ancient question wearing a modern coat. Are we alone? And if not, how would we know? It is possible that the galaxy is crowded and indifferent, that artifacts blow like pollen, that signals present as accidents, and that meaning is a human projection on a basalt wall. It is also possible the galaxy is quieter than a graveyard, with only the physics of stars to keep it from being perfectly still. Between these poles, a slender country exists where the evidence is incremental and the consequences are infinite. 3i Atlas does not tip the balance, but it extends the map. It demonstrates that interstellar traffic is not a metaphor. It is a measurable fact. It suggests that if artifacts exist, The boundary between natural and constructed may be epistemic rather than obvious, a distinction we make not at first sight, but after seasons of inspection and the humility to admit surprise. This shift is not merely academic. It changes what we teach, how we recruit minds into the shared enterprise, and how we narrate our place to ourselves. It asks architects of policy to consider frameworks for discovery that do not begin with denial and end with possession, but rather with stewardship and patience. The future, the object points toward smells of singed metal and cold electronics and starlight drifting across a visor. We will launch interceptors that are less rockets than birds, compact, intelligent, equipped with cameras that can dream in spectra, and arms that can collect without bruising. They will wait on orbit like tools on a pegboard, and when the next interstellar pebble announces itself in the margins of a survey image, they will fall off the peg and fly. We will seed the outer solar system with sentinels that measure interstellar weather the way buoys measure swells, so that we do not mistake a gust for a purpose or a calm for an absence. We what? You'll write algorithms that look at light and learn to see not just brightness, but intention's shadow. Then force those algorithms to defend their claims with physics, not bravado. On the ground, archives will reopen like flowers after a frost, not because institutions become saints, but because communities learn. And in the studios where we teach the public to care, the language will shift from once in a generation to routine, not to diminish wonder, but to normalize competence. The next century of space exploration will be less about conquering distances and more about conversing across them, sending questions whose grammar is engineering to addresses we do not yet know, then waiting, listening, revising, and trying again. If this sounds romantic, let it be tempered by the knowledge that the cosmos is not sentimental. Stars shear, dust grinds, radiation edits molecules with the cruelty of an indifferent editor. To meet the universe is to accept that we are fragile in a place that does not notice, and to build anyway. The power of 3i Atlas lies in its refusal to be an answered question. It is an exam written in a script we can copy but not yet read, insisting we show our work. That insistence will carve new missions from skepticism, fund new instruments from disagreements, and invite new minds who thrill not at certainties, but at the chance to make them. In the end, perhaps the archive's brief opacity will be remembered less as a scandal than as a rehearsal for better habits, a reminder that secrecy is a tax we pay when we fear being wrong, and that the tax rate drops when we invest in explanation. The object sails on now, bearing away from our sun with the serenity of a ship that has cleared the reef. It will leave us the way all good teachers do, richer with questions and poorer with excuses. Somewhere in that outbound wake, a thin thread of acceleration still stitches possibility to fact, and our job is to follow the seam with eyes open and instruments honest, until the day comes when the numbers confess not merely that something passed, but that something spoke, and we finally learned the word for hello, written in the realm between starlight and silence.